Well, welcome again um, to this session on the Book of Mark. We're continuing with our study on the Book of Mark, and we're looking forward to the final few chapters that we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. So, Craig, I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dwight. And great to be with you all again. And where we left off last week, actually, we were in the middle of something. So I'm going to go back, briefly summarize what we covered at the beginning of what we're in the middle of, and then pick up there. Because what we are picking up with this week actually frames a section. The cursing of the fig tree with leaves, but not really having fruit, even though from the rest of Mark's gospel, we see that fruit often, Jesus used it parabolically to speak of like the fruit of repentance or the fruit of responding to God's message, to God's word. And the vineyard owner is asking for fruit in the next chapter, chapter 12. But the people, actually, it's not the people of Israel. The people of Israel are very open and welcoming to Jesus, but the leaders, the elite aristocrats, especially in Jerusalem, they are not willing to hand the fruit of the vineyard over to the vineyard owner. So that'll be chapter 12. But we already see Jesus setting things up, talking about fruit with the fig tree, which has leaves but no fruit. And you say, well, it shouldn't have had fruit yet anyway. It was Passover season. But what we mentioned briefly last week was that normally, well, often fig trees, by the time they have leaves, they can have early fruits called bribas. Not as appetizing, but they're still digestible. And often in the Old Testament, it speaks of first ripe figs. And these would be referring to the bribas, which I may or may not be pronouncing correctly. I should have asked one of my friends who speaks Spanish properly. But anyway, so the question is he talking really about figs? Or is that just a figment of our imagination? Or is he talking about figs as a way of talking about, like in the Old Testament, often bearing fruit spiritually for God? The fig tree withers later. Now in Matthew, we have the fig tree wither at once. But in Mark, it's actually they come back the next day and they find the fig tree withered. Jesus has enacted parable in Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26, where he heals a blind man in two stages. Well, here we also have a two-stage miracle because they don't see it wither at once. They see it when they come back the next day. This may be, like the previous case, kind of an acted parable, because there he was dealing with the disciples who were half blind still. And here he's going to be dealing with a tree that looks like it ought to have fruit, but it really doesn't. Why does Matthew have the fig tree wither at once when Mark has it wither in two stages? Well, Matthew likes orderly structure. He often condenses Mark's material. And when you tell a story, you can either tell it with all the details, or you can leave out some of the details. And when you leave out extraneous details that you don't want to go into, sometimes you'll telescope a story. There may have been things that happened on two different days, but you'll narrate them as if it's all the same day because you just don't have time to go into it. Luke does that. Luke chapter 24. You think Jesus ascends on the day of his resurrection or very soon afterwards. But you read in Acts chapter 1 by the same author, the sequel, Acts is the sequel to Luke, and it opens up and we find out that there's 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension. Does Luke expect nobody to notice the difference? Rather, Luke understands that everybody understood that you don't always go into all the details and explain like everything from one place to another. But when you condense a narrative, you're just telling some of the things that happened. And by giving the more detailed version, later on, it complements rather than contradicts the earlier version. And sometimes people today, they don't understand that, and they go wild on, the differences, even though we have those in ordinary speech ourselves. So yeah, even in ordinary condensing, we do that as we're talking. So, but most scholars see a reason that in Mark it's structured the way it is, with two stages, because often when Mark has what scholars often call a Markan sandwich, point A here and then point A here, and then in between you have point B dealing with something else. There's a relationship between point B and point A. Jesus curses the fig tree in verses 12 through 14. In verses 20 to 21, they come back the next day and find the fig tree withered. In between, Jesus implicitly prefigures and prophesies judgment on the temple. The temple was something that looked like it should have lots of fruit, just like the fig tree, but it wasn't bearing the fruit for God. The temple authorities weren't handing the fruit over to God. Jesus' view of judgment on the temple is going to resurface repeatedly as Mark goes on. 13 and verse 2, do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here on another. All of them will be thrown down. 13, 14, when you see the desolating sacrilege, which takes place in the temple. 1458, false witnesses report, we heard him say, I'll destroy this temple that's made with hands. Well, Jesus said no such thing, but he did talk about the temple's destruction, and chances are what they're giving, even though it's a garbled report, even though it's distorted, it actually depends on the reality that Jesus is going to be involved in the destruction of the temple somehow, even if it's just declaring that it's going to happen. And at the cross, as people go by and mock him, they say, you who would destroy the temple. And as the prophet, he's blamed as the cause, as sometimes happened. Jeremiah, people didn't like him prophesying judgment because they thought, you're going to make it happen. Negative confession, whatever. But when Jesus dies on the cross in 1538, the veil of the temple is torn, and God declares his judgment on the temple. Well, fig trees or figs representing God's people, you already have that in the Old Testament. Hosea 9:10, like grapes in the wilderness, I found Israel, like the first fruit in the fig tree in its first season, I saw your ancestors. So that brings us to the cleansing of the temple, as it's called. Some people call it the cleansing of the temple. Some people call it active judgment in the temple, so on. Whatever you want to call it, it didn't turn out too well for the temple. These are just pictures of the temple model from Jerusalem. Here is a door jamb of the triple gate in the temple. By the way, that one actually is real. It's not just a model. That one is still there. And I thank Todd Bolin for most of these photos, Heather Biscoe for a few of them. The court of the Gentiles on the Jerusalem model would be where Jesus was overturning the tables. If you can see these places with, well, the columns all around, those were really big columns. You could get like maybe 3 people wrapping their arms around to get around one of those columns. They were huge. But if you see these, I don't know if you can tell that they're staircases. They have holes in them. I don't know if you can see my cursor on this. I'm trying to point out where it is. But there were steps from down below that led up into this court of the Gentiles. And you'd come out of here, and along one of the sides is where they had the people buying and selling in the outer court of the temple. Here's another picture. You can see more clearly kind of the hole that looks like it's underground. People would come up from those stairs and then congregate in this outer court of the temple. Here are the remains of some shops along the western wall of the Temple Mount. We call them remains, but they don't remain very obviously. Here were some shops underneath the staircase of Robinson's Arch. This was an arch that had the staircase leading up into the temple, well, one of the staircases leading up into the temple. And when we talk about the tables of the money changers, here's what some of the money looked like. That's not George Washington on those coins. That's actually Melkart, who was a Phoenician deity. These are Tyrian shekels, which were used for the currency in Jerusalem's temple. Now, why they were using shekels with a pagan deity on it? Well, they didn't want to use one with the emperor's picture on it, although that'll come out in chapter 12. You've got somebody there who's challenging Jesus, but they still have some coins with the emperor's image there. So Jesus casts out the buyers and the sellers. The tourist merchandise may have been outside the temple proper. The things that were being sold in the temple were actually necessary. Like you needed doves for sacrifices, unless you wanted to bring your own from Galilee or Rome or wherever you were coming from. The term for dove, it also can mean pigeon, and it's the term that's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament for birds used for sacrifices. And this is not one of the temple sellers. This is actually my nephew who was feeding some pigeons in Congo. We have remains of some of the dovecotes of the places where the doves were raised for use in the temple. This is a dovecote somewhere else. And here's another place. You know, they had lots of room for doves or pigeons because they would have to raise a lot of them. And the dove's dung, I don't know, you could use it for fuel. So there were people who had pet birds, but these are not pet birds they're sacrificing. These are ones raised for sacrifice. Well, the term for Jesus casting out these people who are buying and selling, it's a term that Mark uses a lot. And it refers to, you know, things like sending people away and so on, but most often it's used for casting out demons. So it's not the most pleasant term. I mean, Jesus is forcefully driving people out, not saying he's using violence against them, but he's at least scaring them out and overturning the tables of the money chain. He's making a big scene. He casts out the commercial activity from the temple. Now, this is not to say that all buying or selling is wrong. Like in Revelation 13, 17, and 18, you have to have the mark of the beast to buy and sell in that system. But not all buying and selling was wrong. I mean, you have people doing some buying and selling elsewhere in Mark's gospel in ways that honor God. But the problem might be something like the reduction of religion to, or the exploitation of religion for economic interests. Something that we see much more conspicuously, I think, in the church in the US. I'm not talking about every local church, but in the church in general, a lot is really driven by marketing to religious consumers. It's a consumer culture. And if you want to get stuff out, the stuff that gets marketed is not necessarily the stuff that people know is the best. I know this is a struggle for Christian bookstore owners and the ones that are still in business in a lot of other places, because you have a bunch of stuff that isn't really edifying, and sometimes the store owners know it, but they have to stay in business. But they try to balance it by having, some of them try to balance it by having some good, useful stuff as well. I don't have a solution for American consumerism, but insofar as it can depend on us, may we market and push what's true and what will build up God's people, and not just what sells well. Like the spiritual, you know, I saw Elvis last week, and the Lord showed me in a vision Elvis last week. That would get a lot of hits on the internet. But anyway, why does he drive them out? Well, there's a big debate about that. Money changers probably didn't have a big profit margin. as far as we can gather, especially given the fact that if somebody cheats them, they change coinage and what they got is counterfeit, they're going to lose money. So they don't have a big profit margin. Were the chief priests taking a cut? It's not absolutely clear, but we do know that a lot of the chief priests were economically corrupt. I'll talk about that in a few moments. Also, it seems like Jesus treats even the outer court as sacred space. The idea was, for a lot of people, well, the sacred space is the Holy of Holies, and then the priestly sanctuary, the court of Israel, the court of women. But the outer court, that's not really as sacred as the other courts. It's in terms of Greek temples, it would have been called the temenos. But Jesus treats the whole thing as sacred, because Gentiles couldn't go beyond this point. So you've got some people who are being disenfranchised and marginalized from the worship of Israel's God. And people like the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, he couldn't even become Jewish. He couldn't become a proselyte. So Jesus is challenging the priestly establishment. Certainly, they would have seen this as an affront to their own authority. And the way things worked, with the emphasis on honor and shame, if you challenge somebody, they try to get you back. And until they get you back, it's a condition of enmity, because they've lost honor until they can get you back. And Jesus keeps beating them in public debates. So they're going to have to go at him another way. But Jesus is drawing attention to what the temple is supposed to be about. In 11:17, we'll see that more. Of course, today, religion never exploits anybody, right? That's actually part of what the Reformation was about, was Luther complaining about Tetzel selling people indulgences so their relatives in purgatory could get out, and so on. Well, the idea of cleansing the temple may go back partly to Malachi, where it says, I'm sending my messenger before your face to prepare the way. This is quoted in Mark chapter 1 and verse 2, right up front, early in Mark's gospel. And then the Lord will come suddenly to his temple, and he's going to be like a refiner's fire, and he's going to purify the temple. He's going to purify the sons of Levi, drawing them near to judgment. And if they don't repent, there's going to be a curse in them and a curse in the land. So the idea is the Lord is going to come to his temple, and people better get right. Well, does Jesus encounter any resistance from the temple's guardians? Yeah, right after the cleansing of the temple, Jesus gives his biblical rationale for that in 11:17 and 11:18. When the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. But they were afraid of him. He was too popular with the people. And some people had wanted to kill him earlier, but they weren't really that powerful. Now he's dealing with the people who are the most powerful people in all the land of Judea, next to the Roman government. Jesus virtually provoked his execution with this act, and then not getting out of town. A generation later, somebody just prophesied against the temple, and they almost had him executed. He was beaten, Josephus says, until his bones showed. Well, you've got the inner courts here, but the outer court, that's what would be L on this map. Oh no, actually the outer court is even beyond that. The outer court is, I guess, N over here. L is the court of women. You have the Holy of Holies, the Holy of Holies, the priestly sanctuary, the court of Israel, the court of women, and then beyond that you have the outer court. And this is the Temple Mount viewed from the south. And there are gates here with stairs leading up into the temple. There were warning inscriptions on the balustrade that separated the women's court from the outer court. I'll explain those differences more in a few minutes. Right now I'm just showing you the pictures, but there was a warning, a temple sign that said any Gentile who goes beyond this point will be responsible for their death, which will shortly ensue. I mean, here in the US, we had segregated water fountains and so on, whites only, coloreds only, so on. They were pretty explicit with their segregation sign in the temple in Jerusalem. Gentiles don't go beyond this point. And they had reasons for that because of, purity considerations, which is also why they put women on a lower level than men. But again, we'll talk about that in a little while. These are just pictures. So here we're going to talk about the structure of the temple. The Old Testament temple didn't segregate Gentiles from Israel in the worship of God. The innermost court, the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, depending on your translation, that was for Adonai alone, for the Lord alone. Next was the sanctuary for priests. Outside both was the outer court, just one outer court. Jew, Gentile, didn't matter, men, women. Solomon in 1 Kings 8 prays for the Gentiles to feel welcome. But there was a big emphasis on ritual purity that spread in Jewish faith after the time of the Maccabees, and especially in the first century before Jesus' ministry, up until the year 70. And due to these purity considerations, Herod actually had priests building the temple, so only holy people would be inside. He had them trained as stonemasons, so they could do the actual building. And you still have the Holy of Holies and the priestly sanctuary, but now you have the outer court divided into 3 sections. So the first is the court of Israel, and then beyond that, on a lower level, you have the court of women, because they were considered more susceptible to ritual impurity 1 week out of every month, and might start happening to them when they're in the court of Israel. So they're segregated from the court of Israel, which is only Jewish men. So outside that, you have the court of women, and then outside that, you have what now constitutes de facto the outer court for everybody, and Gentiles couldn't go beyond that point. And in fact, if they tried to and they were caught, they would be killed. Jesus may have challenged that division. Money changing to local currency was a relative novelty in the temple, but it was needed for efficiency in purchasing sacrifices because, well, every locality had their own coinage. So you needed a standard coinage in the temple for buying sacrifices. So you had money changers who would, they change everything into the Tyrian coinage. That's the one with the god milk heart on the image there. But Gentiles were segregated from the heart of divine worship against God's ideal purpose. Money changing, buying and selling, all this going on in the outer court, that was the only place where the Gentiles could encounter the God of Israel, even though Israel was to be a light to the nations. So Jesus cried out 2 texts as he overturned the tables. The first one is from Isaiah 56 and verse 7, which talks about foreigners and eunuchs being welcomed among God's people. And he says, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations." And Mark has a heavy emphasis here. Matthew and Luke leave out some of the wording here because their emphasis is just in the judgment part. But this was to be for the Gentiles. They were to be welcome in God's house. From the beginning, that's the way God had intended it. And Mark cares about this as well. Jesus says, "This house should be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a robber's den." Well, where's that last line from, the robber's den part? That goes back to Jeremiah chapter 7 and verse 11, where Israel cried out, "The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord is in our midst. God won't judge us." And God says, "Do you think that you are free to steal, to rip off your neighbor, to commit adultery, to commit murder, to commit all these crimes, and then come into my house and say, we are free to do all these things? This is God's house. He certainly won't judge us here. Has my house become like a robber's den in your sight?" Robbers' dens were where robbers stored their loot, often in caves, thinking themselves safe. And God says, you're treating my house like a robber's den, thinking it's a safe haven for you. but I can do to this house like I did to Shiloh, the place where the tabernacle had once been, and God destroyed that place. Jesus was pronouncing judgment on a religious institution that had ceased to fulfill God's purposes. Well, earlier, Jeremiah smashed a pot in the temple to symbolize its imminent destruction. Jesus, even more dramatically, overturns tables. Could this have any implications for our religious institutions today? Especially religious institutions that don't welcome everybody, that are segregated uh, ethnically or whatever else. Now, it's one thing if nobody's coming, but if nobody's welcome, then, anyway. Robbers. In Jeremiah, this wasn't just people who were buying and selling in the temple. I mean, the robbers in Jeremiah, it's the image for wicked people who suppose that they have a safe place. And here's what he says: stop oppressing the immigrants, the orphans and the widows. Stop oppressing the poor. Stop shedding innocent blood. And stop going after other gods. But they're stealing, murdering, committing adultery, swearing falsely, making offerings to Baal, going after other gods. Now, is it talking about economic exploitation in Mark 11:15, where he's casting out the people buying and selling, and then he goes on to speak of robbers? It may not be the issue so much of the money changers themselves, which we often think of. It may be more the aristocratic priesthood who was running the temple. And it may have been the money changers, but it's hard to say at this distance. We don't have enough data to be sure, or at least I don't have enough data to be sure from what I've seen. But the aristocratic priesthood that was running the temple was certainly corrupt. And that's not based only on the Gospels. That's based on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, based on what the later rabbis say. Basically, everybody has said it, that the priestly leaders of the temple were corrupt in the late Second Temple period. It's not Israel as a whole, but it was the leaders. So Josephus talks about how the high priests, they sent their servants to the threshing floors. The tithe was supposed to support all the priests. They ripped off the lower priests, and some of the lower class priests, because they had no other means of income, ended up starving to death because of the exploitation of the rich priests. The high priest Ananias, this is a later high priest, he increased in glory every day, great hoarder of money, got his way whatever he wanted because he had plenty of money to bribe whoever he wanted, while other people were starving because he was taking their money. And yeah, a number of passages in Josephus talk about that. And there was resentment among many of the common people. We know that because when the revolt against Rome finally took place, it wasn't just the Romans who were on the edge of being massacred by Jewish revolutionaries. One of the first things they did, they set fire to the house of the high priest, as well as to the palaces of Jewish royal family. And when they caught the high priest, they killed him and his brother. And also later rabbis said, the first temple, the one that was destroyed back in Jeremiah's day, 586 BC, was destroyed for idolatry. But why was the second temple destroyed? This is a generation after Jesus predicted its destruction. The rabbis said the second temple was destroyed because the priests loved money and hated one another. Why did the elite dislike Jesus? Well, it says they were scared of him because the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. They were jealous, and they figured they better silence the guy soon. So they say, so where did you get your authority to do these things, to overturn these tables in the temple? Jesus says, same place as John the Baptist got his authority. Where did he get his? And being good politicians, they obfuscate because they don't dare say, he got it from the devil or something, because, John the Baptist was popular with the people. They don't want to dig themselves in deeper. The priestly aristocrats, unlike the Pharisees, were not popular with the people. So, and again, we have that from sources outside the New Testament. So they're afraid of the crowd. And then in chapter 12 and verse 12, they realize Jesus tells the parable of the vineyard against them, and they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowd, so they left him and went away. And later in chapter 15, it says Pilate realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over. They're too scared to silence him in public, so they decide to have him arrested when he's not in the festival crowd. They say not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. And when they come to arrest him in Gethsemane, he says, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me? As though I were a bandit, as if I were a robber? Day after day, I was with you in the temple teaching. You didn't arrest me there. They didn't want to stir up trouble. They just wanted to get rid of him. Well, after Jesus cleanses the temple and does this public action that, together with him speaking of the den of robbers, portends the destruction of the temple that he's going to be more explicit about later, because like Jeremiah said, you think this den of robbers, the temple is going to protect you. It's not. And then the temple is destroyed. Well, Jesus cites that because he's making the same kind of a prediction. After they come back the next day, and Jesus, again, the crowds want to hear him, Peter notices that the fig tree has been withered. And Mark is probably especially from Peter's perspective, but Peter has a big mouth. He's an extrovert. I'm an introvert, but if you're an extrovert, hey, Peter was like, you have good company. So he speaks out, the fig tree you cursed is withered, like he's surprised about it. Fig trees can have really extensive root systems. So for the fig tree to be withered from the roots, that's significant. But when Israel failed to yield its fruit to its creator, Jeremiah says, there are no grapes in the vine nor figs in the fig tree, and even the leaves can wither. Here's a fig tree with, a fig tree with leaves and a fig tree without leaves, and here's another one with withering. Jesus' more immediate lesson for the disciples, though, it has to do with the destruction of the temple, but his more immediate lesson for them is the lesson of faith. And faith isn't abstract. Faith is only as good as its object. So he's very explicit, faith in God, have faith in God. And this is expressed in commands. Say to this mountain, be removed, just like Jesus had spoken to the fig tree and it withered, though it didn't wither at once on the spot right then. And it also can be expressed in prayer in 11:24. So he's going to say to this mountain, be removed, like Jesus is casting out demons and so on, just speaking directly, stilling the storm, speaking directly, but also in prayer, we address God and God hears us there. And we'll talk about these in more detail as well. But one thing also to notice before we go into that subject is that prayer requires forgiveness. Verse 25. Well, how is that related to faith? How is that related to having your prayers answered? Some people think, well, Mark just didn't have a better place to put this saying of Jesus, so he stuck it here. Sometimes they would have a saying of Jesus, they didn't know where it went, they have to stick it somewhere. But I think it is related here, very, very importantly. Forgiveness leaves matters with God. God has your back. You don't have to take vengeance into your own hands. So, yeah, Jesus may curse a fig tree, but he's not going to curse people. And neither should we as his disciples. Have faith in God, 11:22. Yeah, we won't be calling too much fire down from heaven on those who come to arrest us like Elijah did. Jesus actually rebuked James and John when they wanted to do that back in Luke 9. So have faith in God. Some people translate it have the faith of God. It actually could be translated either way. God-inspired faith. But probably the Greek should be translated have faith in God. But the ideas are both related in the sense that because we can have faith in God safely because of the faithfulness of God. The point of biblical faith is reliance on the one who's reliable, trust in the one who's trustworthy, faith in the one who's faithful. Otherwise, it's misplaced faith. But you can't go wrong trusting in the Lord. Removing mountains by command. Jesus cursed the fig tree by faith in his word. He explains to the disciples who are shocked. Oh, how could that happen? He's like, you can do this. What's wrong? you need to have faith too. I'm getting out of here soon. You're going to be carrying on. He explains to the disciples that by faith, one can do even greater things, like he says in John 14, such as move mountains. But remember, this depends on faith in God. So it's presupposing acting as God's servant, not just like, wow, I'd like to see that mountain over there. It's messing up the landscape. Let me relocate that mountain. It's not for selfish ends. It's in obedience to God. Actually, we don't see any literal removal of mountains in Mark's gospel or in the book of Acts, because it wasn't really what was needed at the time. But a mountain represents something that's huge, like a mustard seed represents something that's small. And he says, whatever you ask, you'll have. 11:24. But that doesn't mean if you ask for something that's wrong, you're going to get that. We see that earlier in the gospel. Herod Antipas promises Herodias' daughter, whatever you ask. Well, what she's going to ask is bad. It's the head of John the Baptist. God's not going to give you that. And James and John come to Jesus and they say, give us whatever we ask. Jesus, what do you want? And of course, the answer to them is going to be no, and actually for their own good. But so whatever you ask is circumscribed in the context of Mark's larger gospel by, you're asking for something according to God's will. But if we're asking in the service of God, then we can ask with confidence. There's no limits to God's power. Nothing is impossible with God, but it must be rightly placed faith in God as God really is. Excuse me, this is nothing to sneeze at. Nothing is impossible. Jesus already said that. Nothing is impossible. With mortals it is, but for God, all things are possible. Moving mountains was like getting camels through needles' eyes, a figure of speech for accomplishing what was virtually impossible. Rabbis used that figure of speech for unimaginably great feats of Torah learning. It was an image used by the Romans, not as a figure of speech, but an image used by them for unimaginably great engineering projects. Well, here's spiritual engineering project. Used in the Old Testament for God's sovereignty over creation. God moves mountains, usually in judgment in the Old Testament. So here, people are acting as God's agents. And it's prophetically inspired speech, like Ezekiel is called to prophesy to the mountains of Israel. I have a forthcoming article on this, but anyway, not doubting in the heart. Usually the Greek word that's translated doubt here means to make a distinction or discriminate. And in the New Testament, sometimes it's used as the opposite of faith. I'm not sure yet exactly why, but my thinking at the moment is that we're making distinctions like, okay, God can do this little thing, or this thing, or he can do something spiritual. Son, your sins are forgiven. Oh, but telling a paralyzed man to get up and walk, no, that's, we can believe God for some things, but not for others. But God can move mountains. There's nothing he can't do. And you have one of the parallels that is found in Matthew and Luke. The reason you couldn't cast out this demon is because of your little faith. If you have faith just like a grain of mustard seed, you can say to this mountain or to this sycamore tree, be uprooted and be cast into the sea. Well, a mountain is like the biggest thing they could think of. And a mustard seed, mustard seeds are pretty small. Medine allowed me to borrow some mustard seeds to give you the picture. You can see the little things that look like grains of pepper inside there. He's speaking of black mustard, which is the smallest. Paul also knew that saying. He says, if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I don't have love, I'm nothing. So we want to exercise this faith, but in the context of love. With this mountain, when Paul refers to the saying, it's like any mountain. And the Old Testament uses it often that way, and also Second Maccabees and the Apocrypha. You have this evil king who wants to be like God, and he thinks he can command the sea and that he can weigh the high mountains. But I think Jesus is probably drawing on a local mountain. You know, it's the idea is for any mountain, but he's got a visual illustration that he can point to with the disciples that's in view. Some people think it's the Herodium, which is kind of a man-made mountain that Herod built. Some think it refers to the Temple Mount, except it's never called a mountain in the Gospel of Mark, and the Herodium isn't even mentioned in the Gospel of Mark. But I think more likely it refers to the Mount of Olives. That's the only mountain specifically mentioned in the context as a mountain. And you know, Mark's audience, who doesn't live in Jerusalem, it's the only one they'll for sure know about. And actually, a sea was visible from this mountain. In fact, the cursing of the fig tree takes place on the Mount of Olives, the lower part of the Mount of Olives. But from the top of the Mount of Olives, you could see the Dead Sea. So the illustration, take up this mountain and cast it into the sea. Very good visual aid right there. And anyway, the verb tense, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. That is, you accept that God has decreed or granted it without having to witness it first. This is all challenging to me. If it's challenging to you, it's challenging to me too. I'm just trying to explain the text. And then forgive, you may be forgiven, which Jesus teaches elsewhere, is a pretty big thing with Jesus. Here's this Herodian pavement on the Temple Mount. Jesus actually may have walked in this pavement. This pavement was there back then. So I'm going to stop there. I believe my time is up, and hand it over to Dwight, and we'll pick up next time with some of the criticisms of the priests and the parable of the vineyard and so on.
All right.
Thank you, Dwight.
Thank you. If there are any other questions that you want to raise, you can put them into the chat for those on the group. There's one question here. Does Jesus' statement in Mark 7:11 about the religious leaders saying the money is korban further indicate their corruption?
Actually, there Jesus isn't addressing the priestly aristocrats. There Jesus is addressing the Pharisees. And there were two schools of Pharisees. The dominant school of the day, they were the school of Shammai. The minority school was the school of Hillel. But a generation later, the school of Hillel became, well, after the destruction of the temple, the school of Hillel became dominant. And the later rabbis from that school actually agree with what Jesus teaches here. So it may be that the people he was critiquing were the certain school of Pharisees that didn't agree with him and would say, no, you have to keep this vow no matter what. Because sometimes people they'd vow something to the temple and they'd say, well, it's dedicated for sacred use. So I can't use it to take care of my aged parents. And maybe the principle there is similar to the principle here. Exploiting religion and neglecting what God calls us to do in our devotion to him, which in that case includes honoring your father and mother, which includes not letting them starve, taking care of them in their old age when they can't support themselves.
That's great. Yeah. I had a question on, it's a kind of an application type of question, Craig, based on the cleansing of the temple. Right. Now, there are some extremes which actually have come from here in some ways, here in the States, and have gone into the African environment, selling anointing oil, anointed water, all that.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah.
there it is. Eh?
Give me $1. Give me $1. Who will give me $2?
And things like that. So that's one extreme. But then I've even heard some people say things like, writing books, Christian books, and trying to and making money from Christian books is
Like, like this one,
like that one, yeah.
or like, or like, or like this one. No, actually, my writing income normally goes to being able to give books away. So
Yeah. So I just want to, in terms of application, maybe even think. I mean, I don't know if you've come across or you've even encountered people who might talk that way. I've been discouraged from writing because some have said you're trying to make money out of this and all that sort of stuff. And I mean, you don't. I've published, and I know that there's no money that you really make anyway. But just
certainly
continue.
not in academic publishing.
Craig, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you want to think of the return per hour, like how much you make per hour per book, um, you know, my Acts commentary, I spent 10 years writing it. So how much should that be per hour if that was my full-time job, even though I was working on it like 40 hours a week? But yeah, you don't make a lot of money in academic publishing. But the issue is, well, actually, you have this in the Old Testament too. Like in Micah chapter 3, the prophets prophesy for hire. Jeremiah talks about it. The people who, the prophets who tell people what they want to hear so that uh, they'll make more money that way. People need to make a living, and the priests were supposed to be supported by the people. And Paul appeals to Old Testament precedent when he talks about, you know, those who work for the gospel should make their living from the gospel. So that's not wrong. But when people are greedy and they exploit, and when they tell people just whatever they want to hear because it'll make them look bigger, you know, and then some people, they market fluff. Like there's one main point, you know, just one idea in the book that you could get from one verse in the Bible, and they write a whole book on it. And I don't know, I don't know if it ministers to people. I shouldn't complain about that, but sometimes anyway, scholars do the same thing, not for money, but for reputation. So we just need to make sure that we're serving the Lord. In Matthew 5, verse 16, Jesus says, "Let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." But in chapter 6 and verse 1, Jesus says, "Don't let others see your good works, lest they glorify you." So do we let them see our good works, or do we not let them see our good works? Well, we let them see our good works to glorify God, but not ourselves. And how do we keep that straight? Jesus is pretty clear. It depends on the heart. Other people don't know what's in our hearts, but we better keep our own hearts straight before God. Too many people live like practical atheists. That is, they'll conduct their religion when other people are looking, but not when God's the only one who sees their heart. And in the end, it's God before whom we'll stand in the day of reckoning. And we need to make sure that our hearts are pure before Him. And I believe God also blesses that, like He did in the Bible. So go ahead and write your books as long as they're going to, you know, to minister to people, and then let people think what they want. I mean, you and I know we're not going to make much money off it. And if we do make money off it, we're going to use it for the kingdom. So
Yeah, yeah, that's good. So I think this whole there needs to be an entrepreneurial aspect to some of the things that we do. Even sometimes, you know, bivocational ministry, church planting, things like that. Especially in the African context, you have to find creative ways to support yourself. But at the same time, I mean, I can see that warning of, you know, how it can corrupt us as well. Um, yeah.
It can, yeah.
All right. Are there?
God does have his ways of humbling those he loves. So, if you get puffed up, either he lets you keep going until your pride causes you to fall. Pride goes before the fall, or he loves you enough to provide means of humbling along the way if you're not smart enough to humble yourself first. Sometimes I haven't been smart enough to humble myself first and learned the hard way.
Right. Thank you. All right. I think we'll stop there. Oh, I just had another thought. One of the other things that I've discovered as well is that, especially with this entrepreneurial stuff, you can easily it can take you off the main agenda. And I think that that's some of what also would have happened in the temple there. It probably started off as entrepreneurship, a way to provide a service, but then it and I don't know, would you say that it was totally evil from the beginning, or it became corrupted?
I think more likely it became corrupted. Although the people who were in power in the temple were the descendants. I mean, there were probably the children, maybe some of them were the grandchildren of the people whom Herod the Great put in power when he took over Jerusalem and took over the Sanhedrin. It was his political supporters who came to power. So there was probably a bit of corruption in there from the start. But anyway.
All right. Great. Thanks. I think that's it. We don't have any other questions, and yeah, I think we're done.
We can go into our small groups then, I think.
We're into our small groups. All right. Thank you very much. God bless you, Craig.
God bless you, Dwight. Thank you so much, brother.
All right.
And Apurva, we are handing it over to you at the moment.
Okay.
Very happily. Thank you for your work too. Yeah, all of you.
Great. Apurva, if you